All right, now we're going to be looking at solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. So I've listed the formula here. You'll remember that we want to read this as the opposite of b because sometimes it turns out to be a positive number. The opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now, where do we get that a, b, and c from? Is from the standard formula right here. So a is the coefficient of x squared, b is the coefficient of x, and c is the constant that doesn't have an x with it. So I'm looking at number 43. This coefficient's an understood 1, so a is 1. This coefficient's 2, so that means b is 2. And c is a negative 13. Negative 13. Now all I do is to substitute those numbers into this quadratic formula and simplify it. So x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Oh, excuse me. I should write 2 times 1. I should replace the a with the 1. So I just took my values of a, b, and c and substitute them into this formula. Now, take your calculator and do parentheses 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 13, and you should get 56. So then I have to look at, can the square root of 56 be simplified? So I make my factor tree. I know it's 8 times 7. 7's prime, but 8 is 4 times 2. And, oops, that shouldn't be circle. Sorry. That's 2 times 2. So I have 2 times 2 times 2 times 7. So we have a pair of 2's right here. So we're going to take a 2 from that, and it goes right here between this. So I have negative 2 plus or minus the 2 that I pulled out from that. Then I take this 2 and this 7 and multiply them. And then I'm going to simplify by dividing the same number into all 3 of these parts. I don't ever divide into the radical. So I can divide this by 2 and get negative 1. I can divide this by 2 and get 1. I can divide this by 2 and get 1. So I have negative 1 plus or minus 1 times the square root of 14 is just the square root of 14. And divided by 1 doesn't mean anything. Now again, recognize this is 2 different answers. It's negative 1 plus the square root of 14 and negative 1 minus the square root of 14. We're going to move on to number 47. And here I recognize that a is 2, b is negative 5, and c is 3. So I'm going to put these in my quadratic formula, which is the opposite of b. So that'll become a positive 5 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Again, put this in your calculator, not with the radical, but just what's under the radical. So parentheses, negative 5 squared minus 4 times 2 times 3 should give you a positive 1. And this time we can actually take the square root of it because the square root of 1 is 1. So I get just plain 1. So that gives me two answers. 5 plus 1 over 4, which is 6 over 4, which simplifies to 3 halves, or 5 minus 1 over 4, which is 4 over 4, which simplifies to 1. So my two answers are 3 halves and 1. All right, I'm moving on to number 49. A is 4, B is -1, and C is 2. So the opposite of B, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. So I put this into the calculator and I get -31. In the real number system, we cannot take the square root of a negative number. So for within the real number system, this answer becomes no solution because that turned out to be a negative number. All right, moving on to number 52. It's not lined up right, so I need to add the 2x over here and subtract the 1 and get it in the right order. So I'm adding the 2x and I'm subtracting the 1. The one side's got to be 0 before you decide what A, B, and C are. So now I can see that A is 2 from here, B is 2 from here, and C is -1. So I have the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2 times A. All right, when I put all that in the calculator, I get a positive 12. And from factoring, we know that 12 is 2 times 2 times 3. So I can take a pair of 2's out and put a 2 right here from that. So I have -2 plus or minus 2 square root of 3 over 4. I can divide all of these by 2. That gives me a -1, a +1, and a 2. So I get -1 plus or minus 1 times square root of 3 is square root of 3 over 2, which can be separated into two answers, -1 plus the square root of 3 over 2, and -1 minus the square root of 3 over 2. All right, so that all goes with that problem. All right, we're going to move on to number 55. So A is 9, B is -6, and C is 1. So I have the opposite of B. Whoops. Wait a minute, that's showing through. Let me get this done. The opposite of B is going to make this a +6 plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. Okay, so when we enter this in the calculator, it's going to turn out to be 0. And you know that the square root of 0 is just 0. Well, 6 plus 0, 6 minus 0, that's still 6. So I have 6 over 18, which simplifies to 1/3. So that's my only answer for this problem. And that happened because I got a 0 under the radical. All right, so we got 2 more. Number 57 looks like this. And while I could work with fractions, I remember from the last lesson that I can multiply through by the common denominator to clear the fractions out. So when you multiply 4 times 3/4, you get 3 times the x squared. 4 times 1/4 is 1. And 4 times 1/2 is 2. But it's not in the right order. I've got to get it lined up, so I am going to subtract the 2 so that this side's 0. You got to have this side being 0 before you do the quadratic formula. So A is 3, B is this understood visible invisible 1, so that's a -1, and C is -2. So I have the opposite of B, which will be a +1, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all over 2 times A. So that's 1 plus or minus the square root. That's going to be 25 when I do all that. Well, again, I can take the square root of 25. So I do 1 plus or minus 5 and separate that into 2 answers. 1 plus 5 over 6, which gives me 1. And 1 minus 5 over 6 is -4 over 6, which is -2/3. All right. In number 61, it looks like it's factored, but remember, factoring doesn't work unless this side's 0. So what I've got to do is to distribute that and then subtract the 3. Now I can see that A is 2, B is 4, and C is -3. So the opposite of B will be -4 plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC, all over 2 times A. All right, so when you put this in the calculator, and I don't think I mentioned this before for those of you that weren't with us last term, don't use parentheses right in here. Use the multiplication symbol. Use parentheses here. So 4 squared minus 4 multiply 2 multiply -3. That'll be the easiest way to put it in the calculator. Even though that's the way we write it, it used the multiplying sign in between here. So that's going to be okay. So when I did that in the calculator, I got 40. And then you do the factor tree for 40 so that we can find its prime factors. And it's 2 times 2 times 2 times 5. And I can take out a 2 and put it right here. So I have -4 plus or minus 2, and I multiply those two together. And then you can divide 2 into all those parts. Remember, you don't ever divide into the radical. So I can divide this by 2, divide this by 2, and divide this by 2. And I get -2 plus or minus 1 times the square root of 10 over 2. So I have -2 plus the square root of 10 over 2, and 2 minus the square root of 10 over 2. And that becomes my 2 answers. And that finishes up the lesson on 1.2. So you should now be ready to go to my math lab and do this assignment.